Hi, welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, the podcast where revenue leaders and sales compensation experts break down the strategies that drive performance. At Forma.ai, we recently hosted RevOps Kickoff 2025, a digital conference designed for revenue operations leaders, covering the most pressing challenges in GTM alignment and strategy. The response was incredible, and we didn't want these valuable discussions to be locked away in a one-time event. So we're interrupting our regular programming to bring you special episodes of our show, featuring the RevOps Kickoff Live panels. Different from our usual one-on-one deep dives, these episodes capture live panel discussions with top RevOps executives and industry leaders, tackling the most critical revenue challenges together. The third episode in our series of RevOps Kickoff panels focuses on closing the sales attainment gap. Our speakers uncovered the root causes behind missed targets and the keys to unlocking change. Listen in as Forma.ai's Chief of Staff Kyle Webster sits down with Christina Straggas, Head of Global Sales Compensation at Equinix, James Jackson, Global Head of Sales Planning, Compensation and Systems at Snowflake, and Nabeil Alazzam, Founder and CEO of Forma.ai.
Let's dive right in. So there have been a number of studies recently highlighting that there's a persistent quota attainment gap across industries. So, data from some sources is putting it at, only 25% of sellers are actually achieving quota in a given year. And this is, it's been a continued downward trajectory in recent history, kind of getting lower each year. So I think an interesting place to start would be at more of a macro level. What could be causing this downward trend of sales rep attainment in the market? And maybe James, I'll toss it over to you to start.
Yeah, look, I've seen, I would call kind of a tale of two cities where I was front row at DocuSign during the COVID boom and we call it the COVID hangover. If you're like at Zoom, where it's a very digital first kind of SaaS company, there was an inorganic influx of inbound demand. And so at DocuSign, revenue doubled in a year. We were able to drive in a lot of bookings. Part of the issue, so you could say that's kind of a macros thing where it grew very quickly, but we did not prepare for potential churn. And I would be a fool to say, everyone was drinking a bit of the Kool-Aid, right? And so there was an resting on our laurels probably at how sticky the product was. And so when those one-time use cases came up for renewal, we oversaw massive churn. So we went from 100% growth to, 30s and then down. I think now we're, they're forecasting around 8-9% or so year-over-year growth. And so I oversaw a sales team that was 140% mean attainment crash to 60% mean attainment. And so we oversaw, 53% annualized attrition. It was a pretty huge shift. And so I would say to your question, right, on that side, macros were a big factor, but I would also argue it was a bit self-inflicted, right? We grew up this high and we probably were a little bit too bullish and thought we could grow even higher in the future. That wasn't the case, right? So understanding product market fit, how sticky the product is, I think it's important when you're thinking about quotas and achievement. And then there's a lot of leading indicators, right? You look at the pipeline, you look at the pipeline coverage, win rates, cycle times, how is that evolving? We were just chatting earlier this week and, when COVID hit, people were not face-to-face, right? And that slowed down in enterprise, that slowed down our deal cycle times, as things took longer to close. On the opposite side at Cisco Meraki, we took an immediate hit when COVID started up, and that was towards the end of my time at Meraki. And essentially, we took the hit initially and we readjusted our GTM. So hospitality and retail were crushed overnight when COVID hit. Macro, we made the adjustment and we actually were able to accelerate through what I call the recession-resistant verticals. So healthcare, life sciences, SLED, federal business, right? Areas that are more recession-proof, we doubled down. We were able to grow 38% CAGR through COVID, taking the initial hit from the opposite end, right? Where we were actually penalized initially from COVID with folks not being in the office and using network equipment. So that would be kind of my perspective is it's, a bit of self-inflicted, a bit of macros and kind of how we adjust to it and it's ELT down, so.
No, it makes sense. It's interesting how organizations were impacted, seeing some that, had the boom and then bust, and then some that almost had like a bust and then boom as they figured out how to adjust. But maybe Christina, just over to you for your perspective on the macro trend here.
Yeah, I think that I think COVID was a really interesting sort of use case and the impact across industries, right? So the industry that I'm in also was one of those that really boomed, in support of companies like Zoom who needed, more data center hosting and facilities. And so, we are seeing a bit more churn, and different industries obviously being impacted differently. But I think also that the other thing that has come out of COVID that is creating pressure on businesses is one, the shareholders don't really reset their expectations of a company that has grown. And even companies that have lost, they're not still giving them a lot of forgiveness for that. They still want to see the same or better growth rates, and them making up, especially against competition. I also think companies have evolved really fast. And so competition is increasing in ways that in many industries, I don't think we ever expected would happen. And, the adoption of things like AI and how we really project our growth and how we refine those projections, how we assess our coverage models in our territories, and we'll talk about that as we go through our conversation today. Um, I don't think all businesses have really embraced those things in deep and meaningful ways. And I think there's a ton of opportunity to refine how we look at setting targets from the top down. James mentioned at the ELT level, and setting expectations in a way that, you can do it from the shareholder perspective and what we need to grow, as well as that bottoms up and figure out where the gap is in between. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for refinement that will help us to fix some of these attainment gaps.
Right. I mean, I think the one comment I add is like the speed of information flow is making change like have a higher magnitude on either side. So like something happens, all of a sudden everyone swings to one side of the pendulum and then swings back. And when we see this in the markets, all of a sudden like there's an announcement, $600 billion of market cap is knocked off of Nvidia as an example, and it's like how big of a swing. The information flow just like just moves in a world that's very different than what it was 10, 15 years ago when I first started my career in sales compensation, sales performance management, where I think that's naturally going to put pressure on quota setting and an ability to kind of forecast that growth, especially when it's larger impacts like something like a COVID. I think the second thing, and this is maybe the tale of two cities, but is it tale of two cities within within the sales role itself? And what I mean by that is like, because it's getting harder and harder to sell. And I said, we've literally just went through a digital revolution where we went from like completely, most sales organizations were not as digital to now, who's not on a virtual call at least, once or twice a week. And now we've just kind of legacy industries that just all of a sudden move forward. And so now the number of tools that are available, the capabilities required to actually excel in sales has just raised the bar. And so are we just seeing those that are really good actually excel, and then we're just seeing more of the people that just aren't cutting it kind of perform underneath? And that one, I mean, I think it depends on an industry and an organization, but certainly could be something that as a result of the latest changes that have occurred.
Yeah, I think somewhat related to what Christina, you mentioned as well about like not having the reset and expectations, but I think there is, to that point, like a perception out there that across the board, beyond just sales teams, teams are being asked to do more with less at the end of the day. It's like, do you think that's true for sales, and are we generally expecting more kind of per rep than we did a few years ago? And do you think that's really contributing to the gap that we're seeing in attainment levels? Maybe James, pass it over to you.
I can certainly speak, especially from my time at DocuSign. It is under intense scrutiny, right? The rule of 40 companies. You look at top line growth versus bottom line profitability. DocuSign rapidly inverted, right? So they were a top line growth player. They inverted towards a bottom line, cash flow, stock, right? So most very good margin, very low growth. The unfortunate, consequence of that is there's a lot more inspection on sales productivity. So we built a model, I call it the poor man's LTV to CAC, But you can calculate, like if you're a bookings SaaS business, you're likely on an ACV or, ARR metric or, TACV, TCV metric, right? You're on a bookings metric essentially, right? So you're trying to land contracts. So we essentially built out a model where we looked at how much dollars are we getting, per rep, per segment, per theater, right? In Americas, APJ, EMEA, and then, enterprise down to SMB. And then we looked at their OTE as the denominator. So how much are we paying them and how much dollars are they accreting back to the business? And this is like a very crude metric, right? We're not looking at like a formal CAC. We're not looking at marketing attribution, none of that stuff. And it was pretty black and white. I mean, no one had inspected the business until we really, like, the 5-alarm bell went off and we needed to understand which teams are cutting it, which teams aren't cutting it, which ones are getting more productivity. And there were teams, like, even within the same segment, like we had different verticalized teams. Certain teams were performing 3-4x better than other teams, right? And so in the quota setting process, we're like, all right, well, it's a strategic vertical, so these guys have higher quota, these guys have lower quota. But when it came down to it and we simplified to a, like, very objective number, right? Dollar in, dollar out, it was pretty clear which ones we needed to cut and which ones we needed to reinvest in. And so I do feel like the climate has contributed. And to your point, Nabeil, on like amount of information, right? It's a bunch of noise from ELT until we can provide a objective set of data that helps us inspect the business and ensure we're building out the right things, for the business. And that was a measure that kind of helped us kind of stack rank where we're getting return on investment where we weren't.
Yeah. No, I mean, like that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a great transition as well, because I think, even just talking about it at a macro level, clearly there can be, a number of factors, both internal and external, contributing to the attainment gap that we might be seeing here. I guess just, going a layer deeper, maybe let's transition into, how we diagnose, what is potentially causing low attainment. I mean, what are some of the top things that you're looking at to understand if you might have a problem? And maybe Christina, if you wouldn't mind kicking this one off.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing, obviously, you look at is distribution of attainment of quota. And you should look at that at different levels, right? Looking at it at a macro level is interesting, but you really got to get deeper, to look at it by job role, maybe even by level, by region, and see where you have attainment that more closely resembles where you want to be. And once you get there are a number of things that you can do that are not just looking at the data, but going and talking to reps and thinking about, are our reps truly enabled to sell? And, what's changed or what's been introduced that, maybe they're not quite comfortable with or ready for. And obviously in RevOps, we all have a focus on how do we enable the sellers with better tooling that makes them more efficient, that increases their productivity and therefore drives, higher results for the business. And sometimes I think that those expectations sort of they get increased ahead of all of that enablement. So you do need to have that full story. It's not just about the numbers. It's about how are sellers feeling about the quotas that you've provided. Are they attainable or are they opting out? Because if they're unattainable, they will opt out. And then what are you really asking them to do? So what are the sales processes and tools? What's the lead quality that is being provided, and what's that conversion rate? So I think you've got to look at the full picture of all the things that you're asking the sellers to do, and how does that contribute to or detract from their ability to attain the quota that you've provided them.
Like on the one thing I was going to say on one interesting tell that potentially I don't see this done very often, but it's a very interesting tell when if you roll out a plan where you give the sellers two options, where you can basically say, okay, you choose one quota or another quota, but one quota is going to have a pay curve that's very punitive on the bottom end, and basically if you choose a smaller quota, it'll be a little more punitive on the bottom end, and it's not going to pay as much on the higher end. Versus if you choose a higher quota, you kind of get compensated both ways. And right away you can kind of sense right from the how many of your reps choose one way or another. There's an issue, but yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen that or kind of firsthand, or if you have thoughts on that, because I think it's not done very often from what we see.
Yeah.
We actually did that. We did that as a test in a company a couple of prior companies ago. And it was really interesting, sort of the risk profile of the sellers and what they were willing to engage in for that higher level potential upside. It's sort of just the human behavior around it more than anything. But in that case, we actually saw quite the mix of people accepting on both sides of that plan. And the targets were actually, we felt, pretty attainable. And people said that they largely felt that they were attainable, but there was just a very different risk profile. And so there was a lot of conversation around, what's the seller profile that we actually want in those roles, and what level of risk are they willing to accept.
Yeah, we actually, I don't know if you guys do this. We actually have rate tables. So two reps have the same, they're on the same plan. But if I'm an, enterprise rep that has a huge book of business and I have to grow, 5 million, and I'm an SMB rep that has to grow 1 million, based off the size of the book of business, we actually tweak the rate table. So the excellence point for the rep with the smaller quota is the slope is a bit less steep, but it starts a little bit later. And then for the one with the bigger quota, it's a bit steeper and a bit earlier, because you're compensating for the fact that it is harder to grow larger book of business on that side. There's always tweaks we kind of do on the rate table side when we're thinking about that, so we don't peanut butter spread the for the SMB and enterprise reps.
I think it's how are you thinking about the calibration of that? Is it based on historical performance distributions to know kind of where to put the breakpoints in the rate table? Because yeah, that can be really impactful.
It's always we do Monte Carlo simulation, and it's always I always feel like it's a bit of art and science, right? So to Christina's point, even at a macro level, you are looking for that nice normal curve distribution. For me, I like to see roughly 50% of my reps hit 80% mean attainment, right? I like our top 10% of reps to make 3x their TI, their total incentive. I want them to be making a lot of money on that side. So I like looking from a macro lens. What's the attainment distribution look like by segment, by theater? Are we seeing peculiarities, or is it pretty consistent? Down to the patch level, right? Sales leaders, in my perspective, are horrendous at carving correctly. You need to have tight guardrails. So we built tools to help our sales leaders. We have an account propensity score. We're looking at TAM penetration, account density by segment, right? What's appropriate from that side. If we're coloring outside the lines, we need to understand why we're coloring outside the lines, and make sure we're flagging that, not setting reps up for failure. And then at the rep level, it's the old school math. Are we looking at pipeline coverage? Are we looking at win rates, cycle times, deal size, those types of things? And those all give us clues as to what's working, what's not working. This pipeline coverage, are we having an odd mix in our AE self-source versus BDR versus marketing partner? If it's win rates, is there an enablement gap? Is there something happening from the competition that we need to, hedge against? If it's cycle times, right, is there something going on with efficiency of our sales process? Are reps spending enough time with the customer, right? And then deal size, the biggest thing we saw, at least the way at DocuSign, was we have a lot of financial services use cases, and we looked at our top banks, and you guys know, as the mortgage rates went up, consumption of those mortgages kind of went down. So you see the deal size get impacted sometimes by competition, but also sometimes by macros and budget, and that really tests the product market fit, and how inimitable your product and your value prop is how it stands against price erosion and those types of things when you think about P times Q. So I like to kind of take a broader lens and kind of dig in, and then we kind of see where things are breaking, and then we can evaluate how do we drive better productivity? How do we solve for this issue? And I think that kind of health barometer helps us to think proactively as to what might be breaking in our, because to me, I know we were discussing this a couple weeks ago, sales comp is the end of the overall design process, right? We should be expressing the overall strategy that ELT is driving at, right? We're trying to, incent for growth, incent for top line, bottom line, whatever. Like, we should be expressing that in the comp plan. The sales comp is not like the strategy. People sometimes get those things mixed and we get yelled at a lot. It's like we're expressing like what the overall like business direction is. At Snowflake, we are a consumption business, and we also care about bookings. So those are at odds. If I want to throw all my incentives as ELT, I'm like, look, all I care about is free cash flow. I'm going to incent the hell out of my, TCV bookings, all my bookings things. Well, that erodes, like, if I'm a rep, I'm going to be structuring very, deals that maximize my comp, but it's going to hurt consumption because I'm going to give a huge discount. And now, I'm providing unnaturally high discount that hurts consumption, which is, what we care about from a revenue perspective. So it's always kind of like a balance act. But at the end of the day, like, ELT needs to have a perspective on like where the business needs to go. And then we express that through the sales comp and on like how we structure that. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think like the sales comp team is also in like a very unique position to provide feedback back up to the ELT because they're so close to all of the data, all of the behavior of the reps. I don't know, Christina, I don't know if you've got that perspective maybe on how sales comp leaders can provide that feedback loop back into leadership.
Yeah. Uh, I think what's interesting about these roles that I found over time is you don't just have to know something about sales comp and how to drive behavior or how to set an optimal territory or quota. You actually have to know a lot about the business. You have to understand the products, you have to understand the processes, the enablement, the people. Like, somebody asked a question about tenure the sales force, and how do you sort of differentiate how you set quotas and that type of thing. So you have to know a lot about the business, right? About all across the business. And I think that gives you a voice that you need to use because you need to be telling the story. It's not just the distribution curves that you're showing to leaders when you show them the comp plan performance. It's how does that relate to the business performance, and where are we seeing the gaps, and what are we, what signals are we hearing from the sellers? But it requires that you go talk to a lot of different people, and including your sellers, your top and your middle and your bottom performers. You've got to understand what's driving them and their behavior. And so I think it's distilling that in a way, obviously, as you're talking to these super senior leaders in your business, it's distilling it in a way that sort of aligns it to actions that are being taken, and that you've talked to, the different sort of areas of your business where you are seeing issues that might be impacting seller productivity, which then obviously as an outcome, we're seeing lower attainment. So I think it gives you this great voice because you should be seen as knowledgeable about a lot of different things and a conduit for the sellers.
And I know we spoke about this previously, Christina, but it's like the element of being close to the sales team and understanding the profiles. Like, there's so much other value in that, right? If it's like, if you start to, at the beginning of the year, you roll out quotas, and we touched on this a little bit, where it's like, if you start to hear from certain profiles of reps that the quota's off and they're pushing back on it, and those profiles tend to not be the ones to push back, like, there could be an underlying issue. And I think the more that like you treat that mechanism or that part of the role of engaging with the sellers in a systematic way, where you're collecting the data, you're understanding, the profiles of the reps, you're cataloging and tracking it, the more quantifiable you can be around, like, is this just a gut feel, or is there actually, a voice from the selling organization that there's something off that you can go and look into? And I think one of the questions came up around, like, how do you use the data on like which choice a rep makes if you're giving them an option between one quota or another, and vice versa. I mean, these are all things where in of themselves, in that moment, it's not that powerful. But over time, tracking at a territory level, at a rep level, these decisions that they make and seeing that pattern. Well, if you do that multiple years in a row and you all of a sudden see the same person that's been choosing the high quota every year, all of a sudden deviate, that could be a sign that, okay, something's off. And I think that's, so it goes back to kind of thinking about the reps are the end customer. That's, and collecting that data and understanding that is really, really important for sure.
I mean, I think there's definitely like some art and science there in terms of getting feedback from the reps. I mean, Christina, you brought this up at the beginning of this section around, you know, looking at the attainment curves, but then, you know, drilling down and actually going out and speaking to the reps, understand what's happening. I guess like when you and your team go to do that, I mean, what are some of the things that you're asking and working through with the reps? Because I feel like that's definitely the art side of it, being able to extract the information, right?
Yeah. The first question that I typically will ask them is, do they actually understand the comp plan and what we're asking them to do?
Mm.
Because I want to know um, if there's pushback around the plan, or if there's just general, misunderstanding of what we're asking our sellers to do strategically, especially in years where you're making changes around that. You want to understand that, and one, it helps you get better as you're communicating in future, right? But it does give you some of those signals. And then I like to ask them, like, what is a typical day in the life, or what does their typical sales cycle look like? And that's going to be different depending on where they sit in the organization, what their role is, and who their customer base is, of course. But I try to take that to understand, how long are they actually spending on things like sales process, the contracting process? Are there hurdles that they have to go through? Are changes, in our organization, we're going through a major transformation, sort of stem to stern. And so as those changes get rolled out, I try to watch to see if those things that are changing might impact the sales cycle. I watch our pipeline and our closure rates and our timeframes. And so I'll ask sellers very specifically about things like that, and where I need to provide feedback to organizations that, support whatever that is, whether it's, part of the lead to quote process, the quote to cash process, whatever. Then I'll provide that feedback. But it's usually targeted. I don't go in and just say, hey, tell me all the things that are wrong with what's going on right now, because there's always going to be something wrong, right? It's all, and sellers will always tell you their quotas are too high. They will, if you ask them that question, even if they're not complaining, they will always tell you their quotas are too high. But it's when you hear words like unattainable, that those are signals that I think as a comp leader, you do need to listen for those really big signals of the hurdles that they have to go through, or how engaged they are in their plans.
Makes sense. I mean, James, how does that align with when you're kind of going out to the field to get feedback, your approach?
100%. I mean, I think Christina's spot on. I I joined Snowflake about 9 months ago, and there was a lot of negative optics of the sales comp department when I inherited it. The feedback was essentially, we're a black box. The quotas get kind of shoved down everyone's throat last minute. We don't know how the numbers were articulated or came up. It just seemed to be pushed down to sales, right? And so one of the first things I did was I said, look, we got to hear, as painful as it is, we have to hear feedback direct from sellers and sales leaders. We got to take it on the chin. And we just rolled out our sales comp like enablement. I think this was like first week of Feb, so not too long ago. And one of the first slides I had was like, look, we did a voice of the field survey. So we surveyed 83 sales leaders, SE leaders, all sorts. We got tons of feedback, right? No one's shy about, to your point, Christina, like all the things that are broken. And we also had a tiger team. So we're in London, San Mateo, and Boston. And we spoke face to face with leaders about what the issues are. And sales leaders are clever, right? Like they're going to air out, like they're going to be very honest about what's working. The reps, the sales leaders that really understand like what they're doing, like they're going to be very articulate as to what's working, what's not working. And so all that to say, like, first slide, like, hey, we heard you, we did all this stuff to collect feedback. Second slide, these are the themes of what we heard, right? And you, especially in a mid-sized, bigger company, there is a lot of pre-socialization you want to do. You do not want to blindside sales leaders, anyone, with what you're presenting. There's a lot of pre-socialization. So like, these were the 4 themes. This is what we heard on the left. This is how we're fixing it in this fiscal year on the right. Like, we had this really unpopular decelerator gate for consumption where like, until you get to like 67% of your attainment, we actually decelerated your payout below 1x. And that was hugely unpopular, right? We're getting rid of this, we're getting rid of this, we're driving more alignment on these roles, blah, 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 blah. And so, I would just call out like getting a lot of feedback, just communicating as much as possible to make sure there's no surprises. And we actually did a top-down ladder. So we did like third line leader plus enablement, first line leader plus enablement, and then IC enablement on day 3, just so like they had time to deflate the balloon so that people weren't like caught off guard by the time, like you don't want sales leaders caught off guard from IC saying, hey, we're switching to this different metric on that side. So it's a bit of change management. It's a lot of, you got to burn quite a bit of calories, but like to me, to your point, Christina, you build credibility to sales comp leader by being close to sales. They have to like feel like they're heard. We're not always going to agree, right? To your point, like a lot of folks are just like sandbagging, right? And some of it is noise, but like there's usually nuggets of truth, and you got to make sure like they feel heard as you roll out the comp on that side.
Yeah, I mean that makes tons of sense. I think like one of the things that's come up a couple in a couple of the points now is quota setting, which I mean like makes lots of sense in the context of an attainment gap. But I mean, how are you thinking, or how would you go about thinking or evaluating if the quota or the goal itself is a problem contributing to low attainment? I mean, I think it's one of those big things, right? Like if the quota at the beginning of the year isn't grounded in what a rep can realistically achieve, it's going to be an uphill battle from day one. So I don't, maybe Nabeil, if you could kick off with some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's funny because I think the chat comments are all things that are like, yeah, of course, everyone's seen the same thing, right? It's like, you have what is the definition of fair quota? The curves, the fact that certain people have ideas about comp within the organization. But if I step back and think about what a quota is supposed to be, it's supposed to be a target that's a little bit of a stretch, like, and it is meant to be a stretch. It's not easy to get there because you're like, we expect you to grow or do a little bit more to get there, but it needs to be tied to behaviors that are in the control of the rep. And I think this is the part that a really good quota is actually tying to the workload assumptions that we have at an opportunity or an account level within a territory, and leveraging all the data that we understand on what it takes to bring a sale from start to finish, or from wherever it is at the beginning of the year to finish, the odds of us closing in that segment, that industry, that type of profile of customer, and then using all that data to produce what should be a very achievable but slightly stretch goal. And I think the biggest gap that you see is if you're not using all the data that you have, then it's very difficult to get that forecast accurate, right? If you're using all the possible data that you have to understand at an opportunity level and an account level what the likelihood of achieving a certain type of consumption or revenue, then it's difficult to set good quotas. But I would say the first place to start, and I think we talked about this last time, James and Christina, that quarterly check-in. Like if you're not able to forecast at a quarterly level what your comp spend and what your attainment distribution is going to look like, how are you ever going to get to a very robust quota setting process on an annual basis? And so that's kind of one of the first places, like just get the forecasting more and more accurate, use more and more data, and refine the process and test it on a quarterly basis. You have 4 tests a year now before you have to go into full like annual quota setting. And the second part that I would say, and this is kind of it's a difficult problem to solve, because James, to your point, right, the field's always going to say, hey, it's a black box. If you go too data driven, it's right for the use of AI, as we were talking about earlier, right? For quota setting, you can use all this data. It's a perfect training model. You forecast next week's sales, and then you train the model on where your forecast came in, right, or your actual sales came in. But the problem, the one downside is, of course, that becomes very complex and very black boxy. So how do you explain that to the sales organization? That's not super technical, not necessarily. And then at the other side, if you don't use all the data, it's very hard to be truly predictive and actually make it an equitable forecast. So
Yeah,
the art and science behind it all, but yeah.
Look, I'll kind of share a couple initial reactions, right? Like to me, like sales comp, it shouldn't be a Q3, Q4 activity. It should be like an every quarter activity. It's proactive. And there's signals. I mean, we get signals every day, right? People are, to your point, people might be opting out, you see that in attrition, right? Pipeline coverage. There's a lot of things we should be checking. What we do is we do quarterly attainment checks with sales leaders, and that is like the place where we level set. Hey, I'm observing these leading indicators. I'm worried about this. These are the soft spots in your org. Like these segments, these subregions are not performing well. Is it a comp issue? Is it a GTM issue? Like we need to dig into this now. And like comp is, quota is certainly an area, right, that we need to think about. Like, did we miss the mark on quota? And like those are the questions we need to be asking like earlier in the year. So every quarter we do that. And, one of the things I did is I said, look, we need to have guiding principles as a sales comp organization on what we believe excellence looks like. These are the 4 or 5 guiding principles. And sales leaders, you guys all know, there's some sales leaders that are very quantitative and they're like numbers based and they run a tight ship. There are others, especially like as you go up market, that are they're not numbers based. I said, guys, keep this simple: red, yellow, green. These things are green, these things are yellow, red. I'm going to tell you why they're green. I'm going to tell you why they're yellow, red, right? How are reps making money? Are they making it from their primary measures or secondary, like spiffs? I always joke, one of our guiding principles is we don't want a rep making more than 25% of their total incentive from secondary incentives. So my joke, because our expansion reps, we used total consumption last year for one of our measures. It is really hard to massively overachieve on total consumption in a large book of business. And my joke was the reps that were making 200, 300, 400%, they were like eating too much of the dessert, right? Like the secondary incentives like dessert, but that was like the main course where they were getting all these ridiculous attainment from that. So, you gotta, to the point on pre-socializing, you gotta insert in the back of the sales leader's head the narrative, right? This is what's working, what's not working, why it's not working, and keep, pre-socializing that every quarter. By the time we get to the end of the year, there shouldn't be surprise on the direction we're going, right? Like, okay, we missed the mark on these quotas. We need to think about adjustment for next time around. Okay, we're getting high attainment, right? Okay, noted, right? We probably got to, raise on that side, but it's always about like keeping that, dialogue open and making sure you're meeting the sales leaders based off of kind of how they think about the business, right? So I'm a big fan of like, keep it simple, drive insights, not data, right? People aren't always like data folks, make it very simple for the, drop breadcrumbs for them. And, we should be leading. We shouldn't be reacting. We should be proactive and like driving the narrative on like what's happening in the business wherever we can.
I think I'll layer in a little bit about quota. So like, I think as you're setting quota, the more experience you have, the more that when people are going to feel like quotas are unattainable. So you can tell immediately going in if your growth rate, had been 15 or 20% and we're now asking a group of sellers to grow 40%. Instinctively, that, right? And so signaling that and being careful in your methodology of how you assign quota is important, including the use of overassignment. So I've been in businesses where overassignment was as low as 3%, based on stable book of revenue business versus others that are more based on bookings where overassignment can be 15, 20, 25, 30%, right? Be careful, I think, about that. And when you think about using that overassignment to provide relief, be careful about how you do it as well, and do it faster than maybe you otherwise would have in past. If you're hearing a lot of signals or you're seeing some of those leading indicators, if you're starting to see attrition, you've got to address it really fast, and providing recommendations for how you use that and the clarity of the methodology of how and where you would provide relief, what the cost is, because obviously you saw some comments about CFOs and being feeling like they're comp experts. They also want to just make sure that you understand what the outcome is that you're going to drive with whatever action you're taking. So make them super comfortable that you're not just addressing a specific problem and you're not worried about the outcome financially. You've got to give them the talk track of, and even going in, hey, for quota, we've overassigned by 10%. That 10%, if we release all of it at the end of the year or at some point in the year, will cost us this much on average. So you've got to be really out in front of that. And I think Nabeil talked about it, and James, so did you. This transparency and the need for transparency in all things that you're doing. You don't have to get to the lowest level of here's exactly how we adjusted your quota from last year to this based on these changes, but you've got to give them a broad sense that you have taken into account all of the things that would have changed their quota up or down, what those levers are that you pulled in the comp plan, as you were executing the strategic vision for the company. So you've got to be transparent about that, very, very thoughtful about how, when quotas are already going to feel unattainable, how much are you going to layer in of overassignment? Does that differ from last year or year before when maybe quotas felt more attainable? And so I think there are a lot of levers that you can pull, obviously, when you're thinking about quota and quota adjustments for when you do have all the right signals that suggest something needs to be done to help sellers in their attainment.
Yeah. No, I mean, that transparency is huge for building trust with the sales organization. I guess, like, when we're looking at this in the context of, like, what does good look like at the end of the day here? We see what's actually playing out. We've got this 25% of sellers at quota, but, like, when you're actually looking, at best in class out there, you're looking at your organizations. What are you targeting when you're looking at seller attainment? Maybe Nabeil, I'll start with you on this one.
I mean, I think one of the first things that comes to mind, you should be doing this in the quota setting process, is just measuring the quota attainment distribution on as many parameters or as many attributes as possible, to see if there's any sort of bias or inherent kind of like over-indexing to one metric or another, whether it's territory size or number of accounts that are being covered, or certain types of segments of accounts within a territory, where just naturally the quota setting process is pushing us one way or another. The interesting thing, and I think most organizations are doing some version of this at the quota setting process. But back to your point, James, and we talked about like earlier, is around that it is a quarterly thing. And I know we discussed as a group early prior to kicking this up, but it's like there's a lot of tells too around tracking those metrics actually at a more granular level, to see, like, these territories that have an over-indexing of this tend to be underachieving early in the year, but kind of catch up towards the end of the year, and you kind of start to see some seasonality in that. So I think that's certainly one thing to take a look at and address. I mean, the other thing, just to kind of throw like a complete like caveat, it's like, how's our in an ideal state, in an ideal future where you can actually do it at the most granular level, wouldn't you just set a quota that's visible to the rep at the opportunity or the account? Like, that would be the most fair way to do it. Like, hey, we expect you to bring this in this year for this account. If you don't believe that, then either update your forecast, show us what you commit to, and then it's again. And I think the problem is it's always the nuances and how does this scale down to the organization. But aside from getting to that perfect nirvana where you truly are able to forecast and predict at an account by account level, you have to at some point recognize you're going to set quotas at a high level, and you just need to feel confident that it's equitable, and you can go in front of the organization and say, look, we've tested the quota setting process against these 30 parameters, and it's fair no matter where you sit in a spectrum. So no, it's not going to be perfect, but it is, as we're doing our best to make sure it fits in an equitable way across the organization.
I'll just say, kind of broadly speaking, like, to the point on like art and science, to Christina's point, in my perspective, like SMB mid-market, especially if you have like an acquisition, like a hunter-farmer motion in your company, I would say, like, broadly speaking, you can be more peanut butter spread, more science, down market, acquisition, expansion. If you have reps that are like covering install accounts, customers already, like that, like to your point, you have renewals, you have amendments, upsell, all this stuff, expansion, deals that you can drive, that like it gets a little bit more complex on like, a bottoms up perspective. And then when you get to the top of enterprise, I think some folks were chatting like, webinar chat, like, that is where we are actually, we actually do have a small army of people, data science people, that actually do project consumption down to an account level. So it's a little bit crazy how accurate it is, especially in aggregate. But when you think about bookings, when you think about upmarket, there are always peculiarities like, oh, this customer is optimizing. Like this, it's good as you can make a model. It's going to always be some art. And especially when you get to chunkier or large accounts, because when you're in that like early stage adoption growth phase, it's going to be good. But when you're like pretty well penetrated in the account, you have this kind of like less elasticity as far as, what the behavior may be. There's like more unpredictability in that with your large accounts, right? So, we had a huge account that we were like trying to forecast the quota. And I mean, they were like, that one account customer was like 70% of the entire quarter's renewal was this like one huge account. And our company had like a bunch of outages and they did like a 97% churn. I mean, it's just like this massive thing. So though, like that's an extreme example, but like I would just say when you go to the chunkier, like large accounts, it does become it does have to be a little bit more some art, right? Talking to sales leaders, they're all going to sandbag, right? I'm gonna say, oh, it's going to churn, it's not going to grow. But like you have to get those data points in to try to articulate like and express the best one. Down market, you can peanut butter spread that stuff, man. We made a mistake at DocuSign where we essentially doubled enterprise AE headcount. In SMB, you can do that, right? You have a lot of elasticity to throw more accounts at reps. Enterprise, you got a rep with 30 accounts that now has 15, and you raise their quota. Like that's a pretty like brave thing to do, that you think you can drive more productivity when you have half the accounts, right? When you have a more fixed set of accounts. So just something to keep in mind from that perspective.
That makes lots of sense. I mean, I guess I think it's a good transition with, but 10 minutes left in the discussion of just diving into some of the specific tactics that organizations can deploy to help close the attainment gap. I mean, just from your point of view, I mean, what are some of the biggest levers that RevOps leaders can pull to close the gap? And maybe Christina, if you're okay, I'll ask you to kick this one off.
Yeah. I think a lot of businesses will first try to do incentive adjustments, and that's not always the right answer. So I think depending on how you've assessed the actual root causes of low attainment, the options are you've got quota adjustments that you may need to make and do that in a targeted way to the right areas of the business. You probably need to look at your territory construct. Nabeil was talking about like how you construct those territories and what kind of productivity you expect out of them, and I think you need to test against whatever assumptions that you made in your model, how you were setting quotas and how you constructed the territories to make sure that you're getting the right balance between the two of those things, and using as much data as you have to do that. And then I think the third thing, obviously, is you can go to incentive adjustments if you really feel like you need to. A seller who thinks that quota is unattainable, an incentive adjustment is absolutely not going to really help you. I mean, you're going to probably pay more to those sellers who were on the cusp or at the top anyway. So you just have to be a little cautious about what you deploy there for adjustments.
I mean, tactically, it's one of those things where you want to be as precise and accurate as possible with quota setting, and then that enables you to be way more aggressive on the pay curve and really super reward your top reps. But I think they go hand in hand. So it's like, if again, do the quarterly exercise. If you can't predict within a quarter, there's no way you're going to predict it in a year basis. And if your quota setting accuracy down to the metric, right? Some metrics are going to be really confident with, like consumption, to your point, James. But whereas like in that example, whereas maybe commitments and revenue in the top line is going to be very arbitrary depending on market and macros, et cetera. And so now, where you're less confident, you just need to recognize maybe the only way to do it is to just be way less punitive on the comp side, and recognize that quota setting may be off, but at least we're not going to lose reps that are actually really good performers because they were just unfairly penalized. But yeah, I would say that's kind of a tactic that everyone should be deploying. Ideally, you get to that perfect outcome where you're creating really accurate forecasts and paying your top reps a lot more money.
Yeah, and a thing that's thrown around a lot, right, is sales productivity, and it's like a four-letter word, right? It's like, what does that actually mean? And I we had an exercise where we got our comp measures very late in the game. Like, imagine like 2-3 months before the fiscal year ends, so we're like scrambling, we're like rolling all this shit out really fast. And in ideal world, in my perspective, sales productivity, like that is a spring summer project. That's a Q1, Q2 project. I think, that's something that needs to be in partnership with sales leadership. What I don't like is, and maybe you guys see this as well, CRO or sales leadership wants to do a reorg. They want to add a new vertical. They want to verticalize their teams. They want to do whatever, add new segments. I'm like, man, sales ops, we're not doing our job. If we're reacting to, these things, we're not doing our job. We need to be proactively thinking through, what does sales productivity mean, right? So in the example, like, you can mathematically show how many accounts did the rep touch? Are we leaving money on the table? That's a sales productivity lever, right? Are we actually have the right coverage model in our segments? In enterprise, is it 30 accounts? Is it 50 accounts? Is it 15 accounts? Are we leaving money on the table? Like, those types of things I think are proactive, like, productivity levers. Down market, it is to me more activity based. Like, how much pipe gen, how many calls, conversion rates, top of funnel, those types of like stages. You can do a bottoms up like time productivity study to kind of understand, are there tools, to your point, Nabeil, like, are there tools we can be leveraging to get more scale out of our reps, right? And offload that. Is it a BDR pipe gen issue, right? Do we need to, are we soft on the top of funnel side, or is it a sales execution issue, like more down funnel issue? So like, those types of things, I think they're tough to do, but I think they're so important that as like sales ops leaders, like, we need to be very assertive in like driving that narrative, driving that conversation. Cause, I joined Snowflake like kind of Q2, Q3, and we did like 5 reorgs in Q3. And I'm like, this is just madness, because my team owns the node hierarchy and all the plumbing that happens on the back end. And there's just like hundreds of people hours of work that go into some of those things. I'm like, we got to assert ourselves, and we have to be more proactive to like driving that. So ELT saying, or like someone sales strategy saying, oh, we think you guys can drive this much more productivity. I am always incredulous. Like, show me how and why you think we're going to get more, right? Is it segmentation? Is it coverage? Is it a pipe gen gap that we're addressing? Like, that's because at the end of the day, that's the first question the sales leader is going to ask. What changed from last year compared to what's happening this year that makes you think I'm going to be able to grow this much more? Some of it's going to be organic. Some of it's going to be levers that we pull that we think are optimizing the GTM, right? And I think that having some type of model to help think through that and help structure, and frame that, I think is something that's it's tough to do, but like, we gotta burn the calories and do it.
So maybe just some closing thoughts in the last 5 minutes or so. Maybe just go around one more time. But I mean, if you had one piece of advice for RevOps leaders out there in 2025 to help improve attainment levels, what would that be? And Christina, I'll go back to you.
So I'll start with, I think that you always have to assess the decisions you've made about what model you've implemented and how you've set your territories and how you've set your quotas and how your plans align to the strategies. I think that by critically assessing any changes that you've made, you'll be able to more quickly identify where maybe the assumptions you made were, are not panning out and driving the behavior or the outcomes that you actually want. So I think being that, we talked about this earlier, being that single source of truth for the reality of what's happening with your sellers and providing that in actionable ways to leaders, is really, really important. And truly, if you believe, your targets are flat out too aggressive, do not be afraid to actually say so. And I don't care if it's to your CFO, to your CEO, to your CSOs, but do not be afraid to say so, because they're going to hear the noise. And I think getting ahead of it and showing them how you're going to be enabling them with data that will help them to make decisions faster or to talk to their sales teams, that helps to support the message, and it helps you in the future to support any changes that you're going to recommend with them. So always be in front of it with data.
Absolutely. Nabeil, closing thought.
I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more with Christina. I mean, like, you think about attribution, whether it's marketing, sales, like, what are you actually driving? And going into the year, any change that you make, like, what's the hypothesis? What's the outcome? Being very clear about that. And then, maybe just to add on to the whole pushback, the other day in sales comp, like, and RevOps, like, there are levers that you can do to mitigate the organization pushing a very aggressive quota. And I've seen this sometimes where the board level is pushing for business reasons that are outside of the control of the executives running. There's a demand for a certain level of forecast, which then gets passed down to the selling organization. And sometimes the only way you can fight that or address that or kind of work with it is by doing what we talked about on the comp side, where you just flatten the curve. You recognize, you know what, we're not going to be punitive this year because we can't, where it's too risky. And so, but yeah, just doubling down on really what Christina said. James talked.
Right. Last point over to you, James.
Yeah, I'd just say three things, right? Number one, alignment. Are we in alignment with ELT? Is comp aligned with ELT? Are our operating principles align with the direction of the company, right? If we were able to validate those things, we've set up we set up the foundation for success. I think secondly, there's a lot of feedback in the chat on like data, data is bad. Data is bad at every company. Like it's surprisingly at Snowflake, even though we're a data company, we have a lot of really shitty data, unclean CRM. It's just like we don't have a proper MDM solution. Like those types of things like exist everywhere. I feel like every company, good or bad, it's a big issue, but like being data driven with what we've got, right? I joked about like the poor man's LTV to CAC, but like building frameworks, even if they're imperfect, but like if we're confident in the numbers that we do have, it's probably better than what other ELT or leaders are using, right? If they don't have data, they're just using intuition, or you have this like silo data that's not good for the company. So set the pace, have data points, make sure they're aligned with your operating principles, and those are aligned with ELT. And then finally, like communication, and I think Christina like called this out the best, right? Like you got to dig in, you got to build credibility with your sales leaders, sellers. Like it is so important. And I think the success and potential failure of the sales comp role is having that credibility and trust, that they know that they can rely on you, they can escalate, and that you're fair, you're firm, but you're fair at the same time. Like, I think that's super important in driving success of the role. I've seen wildly unpopular sales comp leaders who might have been doing the right things, but because they lacked like that, being able to communicate with the sales leaders, they were managed out of the company. And like, I think those things have happened a lot of times. The soft skills, I cannot overemphasize that being important as well.
For sure. Okay. Great points across the board. Thank you everyone for joining today. A big thank you to our panelists, Christina, James, and Nabeil, for coming on and sharing your expertise.
The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma.ai, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma.ai, visit our website at Forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.